Reggie Cole was just a child when his family moved from Louisiana to an area of Los Angeles, California called South Central. When the Coles arrived in 1985, South Central, which had a population of 500,000 people, was seeing a huge uptick in gang violence and drug dealing. But by the time Reggie, the youngest of the 5 Cole children, had turned 10 years old, the family had managed to move from an apartment on 98th Street in one of the most dangerous areas of South Central to 71st Street, one of the few somewhat safe neighborhoods in the area. They lived in a small tan bungalow that had a neat front yard that was bordered by rose bushes and shaded by palm and eucalyptus trees. Reggie's mother was a deeply religious woman. She made sure all of her children attended the local Missionary Baptist church every Sunday. She was also strict and told her 2 daughters and 3 sons that they had to be inside the house every night before the streetlights came on. Reggie's stepfather, who had raised the Cole kids as if they were his own, worked in an aluminum factory. He was from a small town in Louisiana, and in their new South Central neighborhood, he became known for his soul food. On Sundays, the Cole children always looked forward to a big meal of red beans, rice, black-eyed peas, and collards. But for one of the Cole children, the middle son named Kenny, home was not on 71st Street. For him, home was the old neighborhood where the family had lived on 98th Street, where Kenny was part of a violent gang called 9 Deuce Hoover Crips. And when Kenny was 15 and Reggie was 10, Kenny was killed in that old neighborhood in a drive-by shooting. His killer was never caught. Reggie was devastated. Always small and skinny, he had idolized his older brother, and Kenny had always protected Reggie from neighborhood bullies. For a while after the murder of his brother, Reggie continued to do well in school. He got good marks in junior high and joined his other brother as an usher in church on Sundays, and he kept up with school social events, playing basketball and attending his junior high prom. But by the time Reggie was 2 years into high school, all that had changed. Reggie, who had inherited his deceased brother's friends and gang affiliations from the old neighborhood, was gradually sinking deeper and deeper into gang life. Because of his goofy attitude, Reggie became known to his brother's friends as Gumby. Although he still lived at home with his mom, Reggie had moved out of her house and into a shed in her backyard. His family called him Reggie, but now he preferred his street name, Gumby. And he'd started dressing down, which meant wearing the oversized jogging suits and sports apparel and expensive sneakers that marked him as a gang member. Then, in his senior year, he dropped out of high school, and at the same time, his mom and stepfather separated. Once he was out of school, Reggie spent all of his time on the streets, or in his shed, where the walls were covered with gang graffiti and where he now grew 2 marijuana plants right outside the shed door. The gulf between Reggie's life and that of his siblings and mother also continued to grow. One of Reggie's older sisters was a bus driver and a choir director at the Missionary Baptist Church. His other sister had just enrolled in college, and Reggie's older brother was a hospital equipment operator. Reggie's brother-in-law had offered him work in his plumbing business, but Reggie wasn't interested. He always drifted back to his gang in the old neighborhood. So it was a huge disappointment to his mom, but not exactly unexpected, when Reggie, at the age of 16, had his first arrest after failing to stop for a police officer, and his second arrest later that same year for getting caught carrying a weapon. A year after that, in 1993, when Reggie was 17, the homicide rate in South Central had skyrocketed to the point where 7 people were being killed there every week. And Reggie was at ground zero for all of that street violence, selling crack at motels along the Figueroa corridor. Running 30 miles north and south through the city, Figueroa is one of the longest streets in Los Angeles, and today it has the highest arrest rate in the city for prostitution. Finally, in 1995, when Reggie was 19, his gang affiliations and his criminal behavior caught up with him. On August 1st of that year, Reggie was found guilty of fatally shooting a man who was standing outside of a known prostitution house on Figueroa Street. Reggie was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Immediately after the sentence was read, Reggie was placed in a holding cell at a county supermax facility in South Central until a prison transport bus could take him to his new home 3.5 hours away in Imperial County. That new home was Calipatria State Prison, one of the most violent maximum security prisons in the California correctional system. A few days later, on the day Reggie was set to leave for Calipatria, he was thin and lanky, standing at almost 6 feet tall, but weighing just 140 pounds. He was also still wearing the orange jumpsuit he'd been wearing in county jail. Only now, as he climbed onto the prison transport bus in leg and ankle chains, the orange suit marked him as a brand new prisoner, or fresh fish, in the eyes of the level 4 offenders he would be spending the rest of his life with in Calipatria. As the bus headed east from the county jail in Los Angeles and crossed from the heart of the city into the desert, Reggie began to realize just how bad his situation really was. He was not just traveling to a new jail, he was leaving behind everyone and everything he had ever known. About 3 hours later, while looking out the window of the bus, Reggie got his first glimpse of Calipatria prison off in the distance. Its sprawling 325-acre complex of fences, towers, exercise pens, and 2-story cell blocks sat in the middle of more than 1,200 acres of sandy, desolate no-man's land. As Reggie sat there staring, he suddenly realized he was soaked with sweat, despite the fact that the bus was running its air conditioning on full blast. But Reggie had no idea how comfortable that bus ride was relative to where he was going. In Calipatria prison, when inmates were sent outside to the asphalt-covered exercise yard, there was almost no shade, and temperatures routinely reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the height of summer, temperatures could reach as high as 118 degrees Fahrenheit. And winters in Calipatria were actually just as bad as the summers, but for the opposite reason. During those months, temperatures would plunge well below freezing at night. As the bus rambled down the road, getting closer and closer to Calipatria, Reggie started to smell the cow manure from the cattle feedlots they were passing by. Reggie bent his head down toward his shackled hands to try to cover his nose, not realizing that there was absolutely no getting away from that smell. It would literally permeate every inch of his new home. Finally, the bus reached the prison. Before entering the prison grounds, the bus had to pass through a heavily guarded and fortified opening in a 13-foot-high electric fence topped with razor wire that outlined the perimeter of the maximum security area of Calipatria. The purpose of this fence, which had enough voltage in it to instantly kill anyone who touched it, was to cut down on prison escapes, and to allow correctional officers, who were outnumbered more than 50 to 1 by prisoners, to move from guarding the perimeter to patrolling the inside of the prison. However, this shift in manpower had done very little to stop the violence inside the prison. There was hardly anyone in California, including Reggie, who hadn't heard news reports about the horrible attack that had happened in Calipatria 3 months earlier. 5 inmates armed with homemade knives stabbed and beat 8 prison guards. None of the guards died, but the incident sent shockwaves through the state. After passing through the perimeter fence, Reggie's bus continued on towards the main prison. As they got closer, Reggie suddenly felt scared and wished the bus ride could go on for a little bit longer so he wouldn't have to get off. The bus finally reached a large garage just off of one of the main buildings. When the bus pulled into the garage, the inmates saw several guards standing around inside, clearly waiting for them. And behind these guards on the wall was a big security door that led into the prison. It actually went into an area called Receiving and Discharge, or R&D. R&D is where new inmates are cataloged, inventoried, and booked into the prison system and their specific prison facility. The bus driver pulled into the designated parking spot in the garage and then came to a complete stop. As the bus engine idled and Reggie and all of the other fresh fish sat anxiously on the bus, one of the guards outside, who was carrying a clipboard, stepped onto the bus and chatted with the driver for a moment. Then the guard turned and faced Reggie and the other men on board and started calling out their names one by one. As he did, each man got up and, with their hands and feet in shackles, they shuffled to the back of the bus, where another guard had opened the back door. There, they would walk down 2 steps to the garage floor. The guard at the back of the bus would then yell at them to make their way over to the door that led into R&D, and there, standing outside that door, were several more guards, all armed with pepper spray and batons, who would pat each man down and search them. After the men were searched, they were motioned to walk through the door into R&D. Although the chains and shackles he was wearing had already drilled into Reggie the fact that his life was now totally changed, he was still not prepared for the shock he felt when he finally stepped through the R&D door and was actually inside the prison. Inside, a guard watched every move Reggie made, and security glass and wire separated Reggie from the men and women who processed his paperwork. What little he had brought with him was about to be inventoried and put into a storage compartment. His only possessions going forward would be the items that prison officials would give him over the next several hours. After stepping into a big windowless room, he was told to take off his clothes, and then a guard with gloves on did the first of hundreds of strip searches that would become a routine part of Reggie's life. Then he was handed his prison-issue clothing and told to get dressed. After he was given his inmate ID card that he would keep with him at all times. Reggie was also given 2 blankets, 2 sheets, a washcloth, a pillowcase, soap, toothpaste, and a toothbrush. After leaving R&D, Reggie was walked to his cell. In Calipatria, the cell blocks were all 2 stories high, with each cell door facing out toward a common area that the guards patrolled. Unlike what most people imagine when they think of jail cells, these cells did not have bars with lots of openings to look through. The cell walls were concrete, with no windows, and the doors were heavy sheet metal with only 2 small vertical slits that were windows that they could look through out into the common area. Inside of Calipatria, every sound reverberated off of the concrete and metal, meaning it was always noisy and extremely difficult to sleep. As Reggie was led by the guard to his cell, the awful sounds echoing all around of people yelling and banging on things were so distracting and awful that his initial impulse was just to run away to somewhere that was quiet. But, of course, as soon as he had that impulse, he remembered that he'll never be able to do that, ever. This was his reality. When Reggie finally entered his single-person cell and heard the door shut behind him, he felt himself relax just a little bit. He looked around his tiny room and saw a metal sink and a toilet, as well as a bunk bed. And as he looked at the bunk bed, it took him a second to process that there was another person laying on it. Although Calipatria had only opened 3 years earlier, in 1992, by the time Reggie arrived, it was already completely overcrowded, which is why single-person cells like this one now held 2 people. The man laying in the bottom bunk stared at Reggie. Reggie looked away. He knew better than to try to be friends with this man. Keeping his head down and making sure he did not touch the lower bunk where his cellmate was still watching him, Reggie awkwardly made up the top bunk with the sheet and blankets he'd been given in R&D. Then, once his bed was made, Reggie walked a few feet over to the metal toilet. He did his business. Then, without a word, he hauled himself up onto the top bunk, where he lay staring at the ceiling in silence. Within the first few weeks of Reggie's arrival, he was given his first lesson in prison survival. He was out in the exercise yard when an older inmate, who was sitting on top of one of the picnic tables, motioned Reggie over. With his elbows propped on his knees, the inmate stared at Reggie as if sizing him up. Then he told Reggie, "You need to find people from your neighborhood, and then you need to join one of the gangs, and if possible, you join the same gang that you ran with on the outside. And don't trust anyone. No one here is your friend. Oh, and make yourself a knife." Reggie thanked him and decided he would take his advice. Inside the prison, Reggie began scanning the inmates for tattoos that signified they were in the Crips, like he had been when he was still a free man. Outside in the yard, Reggie continued to scan the inmates, but he kept to the perimeter where he couldn't be seen as disrespecting anyone or invading their space. Reggie also always carried a homemade knife, which was a toothbrush he had filed down against the concrete. But before Reggie was invited to join a gang, which would offer him protection, he was challenged. Reggie had been making his usual perimeter walk out in the yard when a bigger inmate and a few of his crew walked over and stood in front of Reggie, blocking his path. Then the main guy started muscling Reggie against the fence. Reggie already knew what happened to fresh fish who did not stand up to the first sign of any kind of disrespect or aggression. In fact, he'd seen it over and over again right in his own cell. His cellmate, the same one who had been laying on the bottom bunk when Reggie first arrived, had made the mistake of thinking a few visitors to their cell, men neither of them knew, were there as friends. His cellmate had welcomed them inside and shook hands with them, while Reggie had remained on the top bunk and pretended to be asleep. The men who had come inside immediately grabbed Reggie's cellmate, threw him on the ground, and raped him. When they were done, they left without touching Reggie. Because Reggie's cellmate had not fought back during this first assault, these men would come back many more times, and each time Reggie would be forced to listen to it while he lay still and silent in his top bunk. And like most of the inmate-on-inmate attacks at this prison, the rapes went unreported. Even if a guard took a charge like that seriously, the consequences of snitching on another inmate were much worse than any punishment a correctional guard could deal out. So, out in the yard, as Reggie found himself being muscled against the fence by this big guy, the thought of his cellmate being raped over and over again ran through Reggie's mind. He knew he had to stand up for himself. So Reggie reached into his waistband, he grabbed his homemade knife, and he stabbed the bigger inmate in the side. His aim was not to deliver a wound that would kill, or be so serious that the guards would have to investigate, but to use his weapon for defense and intimidation. From that day forward, while Reggie would never be known as a brawler, he did start to build a reputation as someone who was quick to use his blade, and therefore someone who was not to be messed with. Shortly after this stabbing, Reggie was welcomed into a gang called the 49 Deuce Crips. All the Crips at Calipatria were run by a single man, one of the most violent inmates there, a 200-pound bodybuilder named Eddie Clark, who went by the nickname El Diablo, or the Devil. For El Diablo, Calipatria was not just his home, it was his business. Calipatria was known as a money prison, where drugs were just as pervasive as unchecked violence. Reggie had seen dozens of inmates smuggle crack and heroin around the prison. They would put the drugs inside balloons before inserting them into their bodies, a practice that was extremely risky because the balloon could break or disintegrate once it was inside of them. And all this was part of the drug empire that was ruled by El Diablo. Even the guards recognized his power as Calipatria's shot caller, allowing him to wear a bright orange do-rag wrapped around his head out in the prison yard. Under the general protection of his new gang and their leader, El Diablo, Reggie's life got noticeably better. Not only was he now much more safe at the prison, but being a part of this gang also allowed Reggie to feel somewhat human again, whether it was playing basketball or leaning up against the picnic tables and chatting with fellow gang members. Reggie finally had people around him that he felt like he could trust. But, like everyone else in the Deuce Crips, Reggie did his best not to interact with or attract any attention from El Diablo. Because even though El Diablo was their boss and main protector, they were all afraid of him. El Diablo was only 34 years old, but he had spent 20 of those years behind bars. When he was a juvenile, he beat another teenager to death. When he was an adult, he sexually assaulted an elderly woman and shot her son in the course of robbing their house. In prison, El Diablo was known to turn on people, even his own people, suddenly, viciously, and without warning. The Devil was also connected to prison staff. 2 years after he'd entered prison, he'd fallen in love with one of the corrections officers who oversaw one of the common areas where the Devil spent time. He wrote her an 8-page-long love letter where he told her that, quote, she had 75% of his heart. This was apparently enough for Lisa Finch, who eventually quit her job as a prison guard, married El Diablo, and on her visits to him in Calipatria, she smuggled in PCP-laced cigarettes that he could sell to other inmates. Over the next 4 years, Reggie carved out a relatively safe life for himself in Calipatria. He had managed to fit in with his new gang without upsetting El Diablo. He also managed to avoid making any real enemies outside of his gang. Over the course of those 4 years, Reggie spent much of his time exercising, which added some muscle to his thin frame. He also got several tattoos, including a Ghetto Star prison tattoo on his shoulders, as well as 2 Crips tattoos on his chest and stomach. But despite settling into a routine and starting to feel relatively comfortable, Reggie knew he and everyone else at that prison had a big problem. By 2000, so 5 years into Reggie's prison sentence, El Diablo had gone from just being a very intimidating inmate to being a monster. He would attack virtually anyone for virtually anything. Sometimes all it took was looking at him wrong to get stabbed or beaten or raped. This, of course, made life inside of the prison even more precarious than it already was, as no one knew who El Diablo's next target was going to be. By the fall of 2000, The devil, who was now manufacturing alcohol from the fruit juice he stole from the prison kitchens, had developed such a substance abuse problem that some of his own fellow gang members had tried, unsuccessfully, to stage an intervention. As one inmate recalled, when he was drunk, he was an animal. If he raped you, nobody was going to say anything. But it would turn out that out of all the violent and dangerous offenders in Calipatria who might have stood up to El Diablo and challenged his authority, it would be Reggie, one of the least ruthless inmates who would finally do it. In late October of that year, an inmate using a slingshot fired a homemade dart at one of the corrections officers out in the prison yard. The dart missed and stuck into a gatepost instead. Immediately, the guards ordered all the inmates to lay on the ground so they could do a weapons check to see who had thrown the dart. The guards didn't discover who had thrown it. However, during their search, they did find a homemade knife inside of a cotton glove laying out in the grass. The guards didn't know this, but the knife belonged to El Diablo's cellmate, who was one of El Diablo's most trusted lieutenants. And so as the guards picked up the knife and began asking whose it was, every inmate in the yard knew El Diablo was going to do something to protect his cellmate from getting caught. El Diablo's eyes traveled across the yard and came to a stop on Reggie Cole, who just happened to be out on work assignment painting one of the prison walls that faced into the yard. Reggie was already serving a life sentence without parole, so adding a weapons charge wouldn't actually change his sentence. Paintbrush in hand, Reggie held his breath, but even with his eyes down, he could feel El Diablo's sudden attention and the silence that filled the yard. Reggie looked up and saw the devil staring right at him. Then El Diablo made a single motion with his hand, pointing to the knife in the corrections officer's hand. He might as well have shouted his order. "You, Reggie, you take the blame for this." For just a moment, Reggie's mind went blank. Then he saw in his mind what would happen if he agreed to do this for the devil. He might be sent to solitary confinement. He might have his family visitation rights revoked. And he would be publicly submitting to another inmate, which would make him look weak. And if he agreed to submit this one time, then he'd likely spend the rest of his life at Calipatria under the thumb of other inmates. So with El Diablo staring at him expectantly, Reggie paused and then said the words that changed the course of his and El Diablo's life. "No, not my knife," Reggie said. The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Even the corrections officers looked stunned. Reggie did not look at El Diablo, but both men knew at that moment Reggie was now a marked man. El Diablo would make sure that Reggie paid the highest price possible for refusing this direct order. Over the next 4 weeks, Reggie expected to be attacked by El Diablo or one of his henchmen at any moment. As the nights grew colder, Reggie would lie in his bunk, sleepless, thinking about his options. The way he saw it, there were only 4 of them. He could submit to El Diablo and do whatever he wanted to pay for his insubordination. He could snitch on El Diablo to the guards. He could kill El Diablo, or he could be killed by El Diablo. Reggie obsessed over these 4 choices. He'd pace around the perimeter of the exercise yard, keeping a very wide berth around El Diablo, weighing out the pros and cons of each action. Finally, Reggie made up his mind. He didn't know exactly how it was going to happen, but he knew he'd be ready when the time was right. It all happened on the morning of November 28, 2000, roughly 1 month after Reggie had refused to take the blame for the knife. That day, Reggie was walking around the perimeter of the exercise yard when he noticed the devil walking toward him. The devil wasn't even trying to sneak up on Reggie. It seemed like he wanted Reggie to know that he was about to get attacked. Reggie stopped and just watched the devil as he got closer, not really sure what he should do. When the devil was finally right in front of him, he didn't say anything. He just reached out and grabbed Reggie's shoulder with his left hand, and then with his right, he drove a knife into Reggie's side. Not far enough to be a lethal blow, but enough to send a very painful message that Reggie's days were numbered. As he pulled the knife out of Reggie, El Diablo leaned forward and whispered into Reggie's ear, "You are my bitch." And then he chucked the knife onto the grass and casually walked away. Reggie pressed his hand over his wound, he gritted his teeth, and he walked in the opposite direction of El Diablo over towards the fence. There was nothing anyone could do for him. The guards made no sign of having even noticed the attack, and even if they had, Reggie, like other victims of El Diablo's violence, would have lied. About 15 minutes later, a bell sounded, signaling the exercise period was over. The guards and inmates knew the drill. The inmates would line up and be searched for weapons or contraband before they were allowed to re-enter the cell blocks. El Diablo was ahead of Reggie in the line. Reggie, hiding his stab wound under the waistband of his pants, stood there quietly, clutching a 6-inch-long knife that he had dug out of its hiding place near the fence just minutes after he had been attacked by El Diablo. A corrections officer ordered El Diablo to turn around while he was still in line and to stretch out his arms so he could be searched. The devil did this, and as he was turned around, he stared menacingly at Reggie. On the devil's right forearm, there was a tattoo of a hand gripping a sword. On his right ribcage was a self-portrait of El Diablo slitting a man's throat. Looking up and finally meeting El Diablo's eyes, Reggie suddenly leapt over the crouched prison guard who was between them searching El Diablo, and Reggie drove the point of his homemade knife directly into the front of El Diablo's throat. El Diablo, still staring at Reggie, but now with a look of terror on his face, staggered backwards and off to the side. The blade had gone straight through his voice box, and blood was now pouring out of that 1-inch hole in the center of his neck. Reggie immediately threw himself to the ground, putting his hands behind his back. As he laid there looking up at the stunned El Diablo, Reggie knew the wound he had just inflicted was fatal. As everyone else in the yard also got down on the ground and guards started firing off their cans of pepper spray, Reggie told one of the nearby guards, "I know what I did. I know what I did." By the time the doctor arrived 30 minutes later, El Diablo was dead. By late that afternoon, Reggie had been placed into solitary confinement. Other inmates may have hated and feared El Diablo, but by killing Calipatria's shot caller, El Diablo's lieutenants would be gunning for Reggie. Not only that, Reggie now faced another murder charge. If he was convicted, the only punishment left was the death penalty. And no one contested the fact that Reggie had committed this murder. There had been dozens of eyewitnesses, including prison guards, who had seen Reggie fatally stab El Diablo. Also, there was security camera footage, and there was Reggie's own confession, one that he never tried to recant. Instead, Reggie actually went on record saying that he felt bad for killing El Diablo because El Diablo was a human being who had a family that was going to hurt when they heard the news. But Reggie also insisted that he murdered El Diablo in self-defense. If a judge accepted this, the first-degree murder charge would be dropped to manslaughter and Reggie would escape the death penalty, but he would still face 10 years in solitary confinement. Both outcomes seemed so grim that even to Reggie, hiring a lawyer and preparing a defense seemed both hopeless and pointless. When Reggie was handed a list of county-approved attorneys, he looked at it, but none of the names meant anything to him. However, it would turn out that Reggie's random choice of a lawyer named Christopher Plord would be the second most important decision of his life, right after his decision to kill El Diablo. Because over the course of the next 3 years, his lawyer, Christopher Plord, dressed in his crumpled suits and peering out from behind his wire-rimmed glasses, would make a huge discovery about Reggie that would change everything. And the way Christopher made that discovery was by digging into the murder case that had landed Reggie in Calipatria in the first place. 6 years before the murder of El Diablo, late on the night of Monday, March 28, 1994, 2 LAPD homicide detectives arrived at the scene of a murder. It was right outside of a known house of prostitution on Figueroa Street, the street in South Central that Reggie used to spend a lot of his time on. The victim was a 29-year-old man named Felipe Gonzalez Angeles. He was found lying on the ground with a gunshot wound in his back. The police located the prostitution house manager, a pimp named John Jones, who also became their star eyewitness. According to John, who saw the attack from the second-floor window of the house, he said Felipe showed up to the house that night in a car with 2 other men. Felipe had gotten out, he had walked up to the door and knocked loudly. When one of John's staff members had opened the door, Felipe had asked to see a specific prostitute, but he was told she was busy. So Felipe turned around and started walking back toward the car where his other 2 friends were. But before he could get to the car, 3 teenagers, 2 of which had guns, appeared out of the darkness and demanded Felipe give them his money. They also yelled at Felipe's 2 friends who were in the car to do the same thing. But Felipe and his friends didn't speak English and just stood there seeming confused. at which point the teenagers just started shooting at Felipe and his friends in the car. Felipe got hit in the back as he tried to flee, and his friends, they sped off in the car. The teenagers turned and ran down an alley, but before they disappeared, John said he noticed one of them was limping. John figured in the chaos, this teen had gotten accidentally shot in the leg by his own friend or even by himself, potentially. A few weeks after the murder, a tip from police working a different crime altogether would lead those two LAPD detectives who arrived at Felipe's murder scene to Reggie Cole and his friend and fellow Crip, Obie Anthony, who were both in jail at the time on charges of suspected carjacking. One of the two detectives brought Reggie into an interrogation room, and during the questioning, the detective examined Reggie's legs, and very quickly he found a gunshot wound. Based on the presence of this gunshot wound on Reggie's leg and the eyewitness testimony of the pimp, John Jones, Reggie and Obie were both found guilty of murdering Felipe Angeles, and they both were sentenced to life in prison without parole. But looking at that case 6 years later, with his client, Reggie, in solitary confinement facing yet another murder charge, all Christopher Plord saw were some very big cracks in the LAPD investigation. Over the next 3 years, Christopher unearthed forensic evidence showing that the bullet that killed Felipe had not been fired from street level, but rather from above, maybe even from the roof or from John Jones's own apartment window. There were no fingerprints at the crime scene that matched Reggie's or Obie's, and no witness could ever identify Reggie as the shooter. John Jones himself had retracted his own testimony, saying that he had told the cops what they wanted to hear in exchange for a lighter sentence when it came to his own crime of running a prostitution house. But by far, the most surprising and damning discovery Christopher made about Reggie's case had to do with the wound on Reggie's leg. It was indeed a gunshot wound. However, it was not anywhere near recent. It was the result of an accident that had happened to Reggie when he was 13 years old, 5 years prior to the murder of Felipe Angeles. And when the LAPD detectives saw this wound in the interrogation room, they would have known it could not possibly have happened recently. It was just a big scar. And Reggie clearly wasn't affected by it. He was not limping at all. In addition to the extremely flimsy case against Reggie for that murder charge, another factor that enhanced the likelihood that Reggie was innocent was Reggie's own behavior after getting convicted. In Calipatria, where violence was power and inmates proudly talked about being killers, Reggie was one of the only inmates who insisted he was not a killer, that he was innocent of his crime. And whenever he wasn't in his cell or working or exercising in the yard, he was spending hours in the prison law library researching wrongful convictions. In February 2008, after Reggie had spent 14 years in prison, 8 of those years in solitary confinement, his lawyer, Christopher Plord, took Reggie's original murder case back to court. And this time, the judge decided that Reggie was innocent, that he had been wrongfully convicted. Following that decision, the state prosecutor agreed to drop the capital murder charge against Reggie in the death of El Diablo. Instead, he reduced the charge to 10 years in solitary confinement for manslaughter, agreeing that in killing El Diablo, Reggie had acted in self-defense. By the time that ruling came down, Reggie had already spent 8 years in solitary, which were counted towards his 10-year solitary sentence. So, 2 long years later, on May 15, 2009, Reggie Cole finished his solitary confinement sentence and walked out of Calipatria State Prison. He was a free man once again. But Reggie was hardly a happy man. Wrongfully imprisoned for a murder he did not commit, Reggie was only cleared and made free again because of a murder he did commit, and this haunts him. After Reggie's friend, Obie Anthony, was also determined to have been wrongfully convicted, he too was released. In October 2012, the city of Los Angeles paid $8.3 million to Obie Anthony, and in January 2017, it paid $5.2 million to Reggie Cole. On the afternoon of September 29, 1988, a 10-year-old boy named Francisco was walking along the perimeter of a man-made lake in southern Brazil while poking the ground with his stick. Francisco was doing one of his favorite after-school activities, which was looking for bugs. And this lake, which was a part of the Billings Reservoir in the Brazilian state of São Paulo, was his favorite place to do that. And the reservoir was gigantic, but it was not shaped like a typical circular lake. Instead, it was more like a big river that kind of wound around and had all these skinny branches kind of jutting off the sides of it. And on this particular day, Francisco was walking along one of those skinny offshoots of this lake, where at certain points, if Francisco wanted to, he could literally swim to the other side of the lake in a matter of minutes. Now, Francisco knew he was not really supposed to be anywhere near this reservoir, because in recent years, gangs from the nearby cities would bring their murder victims out to this reservoir and bury them here. And so locals knew it was not a safe place and to stay clear. But Francisco, he didn't listen to any of that because he loved walking around this lake and looking for bugs. And so he thought, you know what? No one's harmed me yet, so what's the big deal? And so, as Francisco casually walked along, poking at the mud, looking for his bugs, he finally saw one. It was a huge water scorpion, almost 2 inches long, and so immediately Francisco, without taking his eyes off the bug, drops his backpack, grabs a clear container that he kept in the side pocket, he opened it up, he bent down, and he scooped up this water scorpion and capped it, and then he brought the container up and looked inside to kind of admire his new pet. And as he was staring at this container, he noticed something odd on the other side of the lake. He basically saw it through the plastic container. And so he lowered the container to get a better look at this strange thing on the other side of the water. And what he saw was this big group of vultures, all kind of standing in a circle right on the water's edge. And immediately, Francisco was way more interested in these vultures than in his bug, because vultures meant there had to be a dead thing nearby, because vultures are scavengers. And so whatever they were circled around was probably a dead animal. But Francisco, he looked around and realized there was no way to get to the other side of the water to see whatever this dead thing was unless he swam. And he knew if he went back home with soaking wet clothes, his mom would know he had snuck to the reservoir and he'd be in lots of trouble. And so, feeling really frustrated, Francisco just picked up a rock and chucked it to the other side, trying to splash the water near the vultures to get them to fly away so he could see the dead thing. But the first rock he threw did not really have an effect. The vultures just kind of turned around and looked at him and then went back to whatever was on the ground. And so Francisco gathered a big pile of like 25 rocks and began throwing them one after the other at these vultures. And finally, Francisco had caused enough chaos on the other side of the water that the vultures got upset and they took to the air and they flew away. And finally, Francisco got a clear view of the dead thing that was in the middle of the circle of vultures. Now, initially, Francisco thought this dead thing was going to be maybe a bird or some other small animal from the area, but when he got a good look at this dead thing from 30 feet away, it didn't look like either of those things. It didn't have fur, it didn't have feathers, it actually looked kind of pale, almost like a pig. But Francisco's thinking to himself, why would a pig be all the way out here? And then it slowly dawned on Francisco that what he was looking at was actually a dead person. Suddenly terrified, Francisco scooped up his things, turned around, and ran to the nearest village where he began screaming for help. Within a few hours, the area along the water where the vultures had been and where this body was swarming with police and also with curious villagers. Normally, when a body was discovered in or near this reservoir, which unfortunately happened quite a bit because of all the recent gang violence, police would often break ranks from the investigation and walk over to the local onlookers and kind of fill them in and tell them, who this person was and what they think happened. But this time it was totally different. The police were totally secretive and it was really obvious. The police immediately roped off the entire area with crime scene tape, and then the police officers stood in a circle, shoulder to shoulder, blocking the view of the villagers so they couldn't see the body. And then when villagers actually walked up to police and said, hey, can you tell us what's going on? The police would say they couldn't talk about it, and then they would tell the villagers to back up and stay away. Locals would stick around for a while, being treated this way the entire time by police, and then finally when the sun started to go down, and it was clear the police were very committed to hiding what was going on, whoever was still there finally just left, figuring when they got home, they could just turn on the news and see what had happened with this dead person. But when they got home and turned on their TV, there was not one news story about this body. And at a minimum, this story should have dominated local news, but it somehow was not being talked about. And then even stranger was the next morning when locals got up, they headed back to the reservoir to see what the police were up to, and when they got there, they found the police were gone, the body was gone, and there was absolutely no trace that anyone or anything had ever been there. It was like it had been totally sanitized. For days, locals in this area continued to check the TV news, they checked the radio, the newspapers for some story, some bit of information about this dead body that was found. But again, there was just absolutely nothing, and it just made no sense. Why wasn't anyone talking about this? And so eventually, in the absence of any official information about what happened, a rumor began to circulate among locals that the body belonged to a local fisherman who had gone missing 3 days before Francisco discovered him. And this fisherman, apparently he was an alcoholic, and he had gone to the reservoir and he had begun drinking, and apparently he drank so much that it killed him. Now, many people wondered, if this drunk fisherman story was the real story, then why were the police so secretive about the body, and why weren't they willing to give up any information to the crowd about what had happened to this guy? I mean, a drunk fisherman is not a super sensitive thing. It just seemed like that doesn't line up with the police's behavior. But questions like these remained unanswered, and after several weeks of still no new information, no news coverage anywhere, even the most skeptical of villagers who really thought there's something weird going on here, they just kind of forgot about it and moved on. Until 6 years later, in 1994, when someone, we don't know who, from the Brazilian government decided they just couldn't keep the secret any longer. And so they gathered up some photos and an autopsy report they were not supposed to have, and they smuggled those things to the media. And once the media published these things, it became immediately clear that the dead man who was found in the reservoir in 1988 was not a drunk fisherman who drank himself to death, nor was he the victim of gang violence. Instead, it appeared that this person's death could potentially be paranormal. But before we dive into the significance of those leaked photos and the leaked autopsy report, you need to understand a weird aspect of Brazil's history. Brazil has an absolutely astounding number of sightings of unidentified flying objects, or UFOs for short. And these are not your typical UFO stories where some person claims they saw aliens or they were abducted by aliens, but they have no witnesses, they have no proof, they have nothing but their own story. No, in Brazil, the bulk of their UFO sightings are reported by their military, because Brazil actually has a government program to monitor UFO sightings because it happens so much in their country. In fact, the Brazilian government was directly involved in one of the most famous UFO sightings of all time. It was called the Night of the UFOs. This famous sighting, or sightings, because it actually happened in 4 different Brazilian states simultaneously, happened on May 19th, 1986, which was 2 years before Francisco spotted the dead body in the reservoir. On that 1986 day, at around 8:15 p.m., an air traffic controller at an international airport in Sao Paulo noticed 3 red lights hovering over the airport, and so the controller called it in and asked, what are these things? But nobody knew. And at the exact same time, all across Brazil, dozens and dozens of other people who have no idea what's happening at this international airport began reporting that they too were seeing strange lights in the sky. And many of these reports of these lights were coming from military personnel and government officials. And so this was like a really big deal that all across Brazil, everybody's seeing lights in the sky. And so the government, in response to this, scrambled their fighter jets and sent the jets up to try to intercept one of these sets of lights, just to see who or what they were and potentially shoot them down if they had to. But when these jets got anywhere close to these unidentified flying objects, these lights in the sky, These UFOs would move away like instantly. One UFO was observed suddenly disappearing and then reappearing 20 miles away in just 5 seconds, which meant that UFO had to travel at least 5 times the speed of sound to cover that distance in such a short amount of time. For reference, humans are not capable of going that fast. We cannot do that. Eventually, the night of the UFOs ended when all these UFOs, these lights in the sky, just kind of suddenly vanished. And then a couple of days later, the Brazilian government held this big press conference about the event, and they would say, we have no idea what those lights were or where they came from. We have no clue. However, whoever or whatever was controlling these UFOs showed obvious signs of intelligence. Now, as mind-blowing as that would be to hear that potentially intelligent creatures are flying around your airspace, remember, this is Brazil, where UFO sightings were kind of the norm, and so people were definitely shocked by this. This was a terrifying thing, but they just kind of accepted what they were told and assumed, the government will handle this, and people moved on with their lives. That is, until several years later in 1994, when those photos and the autopsy report of the dead person in the reservoir were leaked, and then suddenly the people of Brazil, they're seeing this stuff and they're realizing, wait a minute, the night of the UFOs may not have been an isolated instance. Those UFOs may never have left. Here is what the public learned from the leaked photos and the leaked autopsy report. Back in 1988, when little Francisco spotted the dead body from the other side of the water, he correctly identified that it was a man's body. But Francisco had been wrong when he told authorities that it didn't look like this guy had any visible injuries on him. And the guy was naked, and so Francisco felt pretty confident that he would have seen something if the guy was wounded. But when the police arrived and they saw the body up close, they immediately saw he had several very serious and very strange physical injuries. He had these 4 perfectly circular 1 to 1.5 inch diameter holes drilled into his body. There were 2 right above his chest, basically sitting above his armpit. There was one that was right over his belly button, so his belly button was gone. It was just a hole where it had been. And there was also one in his crotch. And these holes were not crudely done. These were done with surgical precision, almost like whoever had done it was using high-end medical tools to make these cuts. Now, at first glance, the authorities had no idea why these holes were on this guy's body. But when the autopsy was done, they discovered this man was missing the majority of his internal organs, and after doing some investigating, they discovered that all of his organs had literally been vacuumed out of him through these holes on his body. Those holes were basically just ports to pull things out of him. Also, most of the man's blood had been suctioned out of those holes as well. But that wasn't all. The man also had one of his ears removed, one of his eyes was removed, and the lower part of his face was also removed. And again, all of these cuts looked like they had been made with absolute surgical precision. But perhaps the most brutal aspect of all the things that came to light when these documents were leaked was something that, unless you looked really closely at the autopsy report, you wouldn't necessarily notice. And it had to do with this man's vagus nerve. Your vagus nerve is something that controls part of your nervous system that's responsible for automatic functions like heart rate and digestion. And so when your body is suddenly in great distress, like suddenly you're fighting for your life or something, your vagus nerve can basically shut off those automatic functions like digestion in order to ensure all your energy is going towards fighting for your life. But in this dead man's case, his autopsy revealed that his vagus nerve had gone absolutely wild right at the moment of his death. It's complicated, but this suggests that this man was very likely alive when his face was being surgically cut off, and those holes were being drilled into his body, and his organs were being vacuumed out. And then at some point, the excruciating pain that came from these horrible things happening to him got so bad, his vagus nerve basically turned off his heart. So it was not these horrible physical injuries that killed him, He literally died from the pain of these physical injuries. In short, his body basically killed itself to avoid feeling the pain it was feeling. So, I'm sure you're wondering, how does the dead man in the reservoir and these leaked photos and the autopsy report, how does all of that connect with the night of the UFOs, which happened 2 years before the man in the reservoir was even found? Well, following the night of the UFOs in 1986, farmers in Brazil who lived in the areas where these famous sightings took place began reporting that their cattle were dying kind of inexplicably. And this began happening with enough frequency in all of these areas where the UFO sightings had taken place that a theory began to develop in Brazil that maybe the UFOs that were here during the night of the UFOs have something to do with all these cows turning up dead. And as that theory began to take hold all across Brazil that, UFOs are killing our cattle, another theory began to come out of that one, which was, well, if the UFOs are coming in here and killing cattle, what's stopping them from killing people? And then in 1988, so 2 years after the night of the UFOs, and right in the middle of all these farmers all across Brazil saying their cows were dying for no reason, the dead man in the reservoir was discovered. And as soon as the government saw the physical condition this guy was in, with the weird holes drilled in his body and his organs missing and his face pulled off, that, plus the fact that he was located in this reservoir, which by the way was in a night of the UFO sighting area, the government decided they would have to hide the story. A critical detail that I have left out intentionally until right now is that the cattle who were turning up dead, they were turning up dead with circular holes drilled into their bodies, with organs missing and parts of their faces removed. Meaning, clearly, whatever was happening to these cattle inside of these sighting areas had happened to this man in the reservoir. And if that got out to the public, then it would confirm for many people in Brazil that, yep, the UFOs, they're the ones going after the cattle, and now they're going after us too. And so this was why the police were so secretive about the body and not letting anybody see it or learn anything about it. And it was also why no news was run anywhere in Brazil about this story. It's because the government was really trying to make sure it did not get out. And the government was able to keep it quiet until 1994 when those photos and the autopsy report were leaked. But like all things having to do with UFOs or aliens or paranormal stuff, it's like despite the evidence, those things very quickly are pushed into the kind of conspiracy theory bucket and they stay there. People do not want to touch that category. So even though Brazil remains an absolute hotbed for UFO sightings, Wikipedia even has a page dedicated just to tracking Brazilian UFO sightings. Despite all that, no one really cares. But if you care, there is an unbelievable amount of information online about what's going on in Brazil, and if nothing else, it is just a fascinating rabbit hole to fall into. The next and final story of today's episode is called Jelly. On the afternoon of June 6, 1980, a 56-year-old man named Zygmunt Adamski, who just went by Ziggy, was having a late lunch with his wife and his cousin inside of Ziggy's little brick house in the English village of Tingley. That day had been a particularly stressful day for Ziggy and his family because the following day was Ziggy's goddaughter's wedding, and Ziggy was very close with his goddaughter. Ziggy and his wife couldn't have kids because of medical issues, and so his goddaughter had basically become, at least in Ziggy's mind, like his own daughter. And so in fact, at her wedding, Ziggy was going to be walking her down the aisle. And while Ziggy was really excited about this, he was also very stressed out that he was going to screw it up. And so he had gone over and over, what responsibilities he had as part of the wedding party. And he had this little speech he had to give that he had rehearsed 50 times. He had it written out. I mean, he was ready, but he was very much in his own head about something potentially going wrong that he would be responsible for. And on top of that stress, Ziggy had gotten into a fight that day with his cousin because he felt like the cousin was being kind of disrespectful in some way to his goddaughter. And so Ziggy had stepped up and defended his goddaughter to his cousin. And so there was this undercurrent of tension at the lunch table, not to mention this overarching stress that Ziggy was under about this wedding. And so as Ziggy and his cousin and his wife have this kind of tense meal, Ziggy suddenly realizes that he forgot to get potatoes when he went to the store earlier to buy ingredients for this meal. And for some reason, Ziggy decides, you know what, I'm going to just put my stuff down now, go to the store, and get those potatoes, even though at this point it was too late to make the potatoes for the meal. And so maybe Ziggy just wanted to go out and do anything to get away from his cousin for a minute and away from all this wedding planning they were doing and just kind of go out and clear his head. And so Ziggy put his napkin down on the table, he stood up, he told his cousin and wife that he was going out to get potatoes. They were like, okay. And the cousin actually said, do you want me to come with you? You know, like, is there anything else you need to get while you're out? And Ziggy said, nope, I'm good. He grabbed some cash out of his wallet and he headed out the door. The village of Tingley, where Ziggy and his wife lived, was a very safe place. He and his wife had actually moved there after fleeing from Poland during World War II, where both Ziggy and his wife, whose name was Lottie, had been held prisoner at some point. And so after all this trauma of being held prisoner and having to flee their home country, they had looked for the safest, best place to kind of resettle and stay for good, and Tingley was it, and they loved it. Ziggy had gotten a job in Tingley as a coal miner, and he had been doing that for 27 years. As for Lottie, she didn't work because she had a disease called multiple sclerosis, which meant she was confined to a wheelchair. But Ziggy and Lottie had quickly made lots of friends in town who were very supportive, and so it wasn't long before Ziggy and Lottie had a very happy and stable life in this town. The little shop where Ziggy was going to was only about 3 blocks away from his house, which meant walking to the store, getting potatoes, and coming back would only take a few minutes. And so Lottie and the cousin back home, they expected to see Ziggy really come back within 10-15 minutes. But when he didn't, and after about 30 minutes went by, Lottie actually got really concerned because Ziggy was just not the type of person to do stuff unannounced. He was incredibly methodical, he was very punctual and reliable, and so being late from this little trip to the store was just so uncharacteristic that Lottie told the cousin, hey, you go to the store and see if Ziggy is there. See what's going on here. Ziggy had worked in the coal mine for nearly 30 years, and he had some serious lung issues from breathing in all of the coal. And so Lottie was thinking, maybe he collapsed or something along the way from these breathing issues. But when the cousin got to the shop owner told the cousin that they had seen Ziggy. He had come in about 25 minutes earlier. He had bought a bag of potatoes, seemed totally normal, everything was fine, and he had left, walking back in the direction of his home. And so the cousin thanked the shopkeeper and then left and began jogging back towards Ziggy's house, thinking, maybe he had just not seen him on the way, that maybe Ziggy was sitting down somewhere on this 3-block path. But the cousin got all the way home and didn't see any sign of Ziggy. And so after going back inside of the house, the cousin and Lottie talked about what they should do, and they actually went back out into the neighborhood asking around, asking neighbors and other people if they had seen Ziggy. But after a couple of hours of canvassing the neighborhood and not finding Ziggy or finding any indication of what happened to him, Lottie ended up calling the police. But the police were not inclined to launch a huge investigation for a grown man who's only been missing for a couple of hours in his neighborhood with no sign of foul play or any other sign that anything really bad had happened. And after the police began asking questions of Lottie and the neighbors about what Ziggy's life was like, they learned that recently Ziggy had been declined for an early retirement from the coal mine. Because of those breathing issues he was having, he had requested to retire now, but they said no. And so Ziggy was really upset about that. He was really stressed about this wedding of his goddaughter the next day. He had been fighting with his cousin. Also, Ziggy was basically taking care of his wife, who's in this wheelchair all the time. And so because of all these stressors in Ziggy's life, the police started to wonder if maybe it was possible that Ziggy had not been going to get potatoes, but in fact was just kind of abandoning his family. And so ultimately, on the day that Ziggy went missing, the police told Lottie and Ziggy's cousin that they should just sit tight, see if he comes back tonight, and if he doesn't, go to the wedding tomorrow because Ziggy is so close with the goddaughter. If he's having some sort of issue right now, he's very likely to come back for something as significant as this wedding. And so Lottie and Ziggy's cousin stayed at the house all night. Ziggy did not come back. They didn't hear from him. And the next day they went to the wedding, but Ziggy didn't show up for that either, even though he's supposed to walk his goddaughter down the aisle. And so after coming back from this wedding, Lottie called the police, she called local hospitals, she talked to all of her neighbors. I mean, she really put out like an all-points bulletin to everybody in the area that something terrible has happened to Ziggy and we need to find him. But despite police beginning to lean into this and her neighbors really going out in force to try to find Ziggy, no one could find him. He had just vanished. On the morning of June 11th, so 5 days after Ziggy went to get potatoes and then vanished, a man named Trevor Parker got to work at his father's coal yard in the English town of Todmorden. The coal yard was basically just this big open lot that had a chain link fence around it that butted up against some railroad tracks. And inside of this lot were just these huge mounds of coal up against the perimeter of the lot. And then also inside of the coal yard was one small office building. And so on this morning, when Trevor pulled through the gates of this coal yard, first of all, he could see the entire yard the second he went in, and as he looked out, all he noticed was the fact that everything was wet from an early morning storm. And so after just kind of surveying around the lot to make sure none of the coal got blown around from the storm, he made his way to the small office building to do some paperwork. Trevor would work inside of that office building for a while, and then around lunchtime, Trevor decided to just go and get some lunch and kind of have a nice long lunch break. And so he left, he went to the pub, he was there for a couple of hours, and then around 3:45 p.m., he came back to the coal yard, and when he went through the gates, everything looked the same, except there was this dark thing on top of one of the coal piles in the back of the yard. Now, Trevor didn't know if he had seen it when he had first arrived that morning, or if it was new, but whatever it was on this pile, it immediately caught Trevor's attention. And so after parking his vehicle, Trevor began walking over to this 12-foot-tall coal pile with this thing on it, and when he got about 30 feet away from it, he realized he saw someone's shoe, that this dark figure was a person, and right away Trevor started rolling his eyes, because there was a group of homeless people that lived near the railroad tracks just outside of the coal yard, and it wasn't uncommon for them to get really drunk and then wander their way into the coal yard, where sometimes they would fall asleep. And so Trevor's thinking, okay, clearly one of these drunk homeless people has found their way into the coal yard and they've passed out on top of this pile of coal. And so instead of going over and talking to this person directly, Trevor just turned around, went back inside of the office building, and he called for an ambulance. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later. They did not have their sirens on. They didn't come flying into the yard. This was a routine thing they were doing. They were scooping up a drunk and bringing them back to the hospital. When the medics got out of their ambulance and Trevor directed them over to the proper coal pile, they were just cracking jokes along the way. This was not a big deal. When the two medics got to the bottom of the coal pile, one of them began climbing up the coal to go see this drunk person and get them down. And so Trevor, as this is happening, he walked a little bit closer, and when he did, he realized that the person who had fallen asleep on the coal, they had really nice pants on, like tailored pants. They were certainly not what Trevor expected this person to be wearing. But before Trevor could even really react to the clothes this person had on, the medic who had climbed up had finally reached this person. They reached down and began trying to move the person around. And suddenly, when they had manipulated this person's body enough, the medic's facial expression completely changed. They went from somewhat routine to totally horrified, and they backed off of this person on the coals. They turned around and ran down the coal, practically falling over themselves. And when they got down there, Trevor heard the medic say to his partner, call the police right now. And Trevor said, what's going on? What did you see? And the medic who had reacted that way just shook his head and walked away to kind of compose himself. And so Trevor at this point was starting to get spooked himself. Clearly, whatever the medic had just seen had really shaken him up, and so Trevor just kind of stood there while the other medic ran in and called police. And then a few minutes later, a police car came flying into the coal yard, and an officer named Alan Godfrey, along with his partner, got out of the car, and right away, the medic, who had gone to the top of the pile and been freaked out by what he saw, walked over with a very ashen face, and he told Alan Godfrey that something was terribly wrong with the person on top of this pile. And so Alan, not really sure what to expect, walked over with his partner to this coal pile, and with the medics and Trevor standing back, Alan, on his own, climbed up the coal, and he looked down at this person. And what Alan saw was a man lying on his stomach wearing a beautiful three-piece brown suit, and Alan immediately noticed that there was absolutely no soot from the coal that this guy was laying on his suit, even though Alan, just to get up here, had basically covered himself in black soot. And so he was wondering, how did this guy get up here and not get covered in soot? It didn't make any sense. Also, Alan noticed that this guy's hair looked totally bizarre. It looked like someone had given him like a really bad haircut with dull scissors, like they just grabbed tufts of his hair and kind of chopped randomly. I mean, his hair was kind of all over the place, there were bald spots. And then as Alan looked from this guy's hair down, he noticed almost hidden in his hairline was this fairly deep wound in the back of his neck that was still bleeding. But there was this weird green jelly-like substance very obviously placed over this wound. And Alan had no idea what this substance was. But as weird as all that was, that didn't explain why the first medic had basically completely panicked and run away. When Alan tried to roll this guy over onto his back to try to wake him up and see if he was okay, he rolled him over, and Alan got a look at this guy's face. And immediately Alan let go of him and kind of had to step back for a second, because the guy's face was contorted in this frozen look of absolute terror. His jaw was open so wide, it was almost like his lower jaw was dislocated, and his teeth were baring, and his eyes were bulging out of his head. And so Alan quickly realized that obviously this was not just some drunk homeless person who passed out here. This was a dead person, and whatever happened to them must have been unbelievably terrifying to leave someone looking like that in their death pose. It would turn out this deceased man in the coal yard was Ziggy Adamski. But this did not solve the mystery of what happened to Ziggy 5 days earlier. In fact, his discovery really only created more questions. This town where this coal yard was, Todmorden, was located 25 miles away from where Ziggy lived. And as far as anyone knew, Ziggy didn't know anybody in Todmorden. So there was no reason for him to be there. And number two, when he had left to go get potatoes, he had been on foot. So did he walk 25 miles to this random town? Also, assuming he did just walk to this coal yard, this coal yard is a big, wide open lot that if you were standing anywhere near it, even outside the fence, you could look in and basically see the entire place. So it just seemed really unlikely that Ziggy could just walk into this very public open space and get to the top of one of these coal piles without somebody noticing him. Whether that was Trevor or one of the other employees that were there, or one of the truck drivers that were in and out of there all the time, all day, doing deliveries, or the homeless people who were near the railroad tracks, or the people who rode the trains that passed by there every single day. I mean, there are a lot of eyes on this coal yard, but nobody saw Ziggy. It was like he just kind of appeared at the top of this pile. And again, even if Ziggy had managed to slip in and sneak to the top of this pile, why didn't he have soot from the coal all over his clothes? And if maybe he had been brought there, if someone had killed him and put him on this coal pile, there's even more reason he would have soot all over him, because they would have had to drag him up to the top of the pile. And even putting all of that aside, if someone really did kill Ziggy and they placed him on this pile, why? This is a very open public place. Someone is going to find him. You're going to get caught if you're the killer. And then, of course, there is the issue of what Ziggy was wearing. That brown three-piece suit he was wearing that had no soot on it, it wasn't his, and it wasn't put on right. The buttons were not lined up. It almost looked like somebody else who didn't know how to put a suit on had tried to dress Ziggy. And then Ziggy also did not have an undershirt on. It was just the jacket over his skin. And then also Ziggy had this totally bizarre haircut that looked like someone who didn't know how to give a haircut had cut his hair with scissors and said, good enough. And then of course you have this wound on the back of Ziggy's neck. Now, the wound itself was determined not to be fatal. It was a fairly deep cut, but it wouldn't have killed him. However, the most significant part of that wound was that green jelly that had been placed across the back of it. During Ziggy's autopsy, they were unable to figure out what this green jelly was, and they ran dozens and dozens of tests on it. And also, during the autopsy, the coroner would determine that Ziggy had actually died the same day he had been found. So he was doing something for 5 days between going missing and being on this coal pile, but nobody knows what it was. And as for his cause of death, the coroner was not entirely sure, but it did seem like he died of a heart attack. The coroner would search all of Ziggy's body for signs of some sort of fight he might have gotten into, some sort of defensive wound on his body, but there was nothing. However, the coroner did find there were very small burns on the back of his neck that were caused by acid, but it was unclear how those got there. When they inspected Ziggy's stomach, they determined that he had been eating and drinking regularly, and so he was not malnourished, he was not dehydrated, he was relatively healthy when he died. He just had this heart attack for unknown reasons, and apparently whatever gave him the heart attack scared him so badly, his face contorted in that horrible way. Ultimately, the coroner just kind of gave up and ruled that Ziggy had died of natural causes, and then the case was closed. But to this day, no one really has any idea how Ziggy went from going out to get groceries to winding up 25 miles away, dressed differently, with this haircut, with this jelly on him and acid burns, dead with this horrible look on his face on this coal pile. It doesn't make any sense. This case has become very famous because people say it is the best example of alien abduction. That Ziggy had left his house to get groceries, got abducted by aliens, and then over 5 days, these aliens did stuff to Ziggy, including cutting into his neck and dropping acid on him, and then they put that green stuff on the back of his neck, they dressed him the way they thought people dressed in the suit, but they didn't really do it right, and then they literally just dropped him on top of this coal pile, which would explain why he didn't have soot all over him. He was dead, they dropped him, and he just landed on the top of the coal pile. And even if you think that's totally far-fetched, keep in mind, still today, we do not know what that green jelly compound was on the back of his neck. It's literally never been identified, and people have been trying to figure it out for 40 plus years. Also, it's worth noting that one of the responding police officers, Alan Godfrey, claimed to have seen a UFO within weeks of finding Ziggy Adamski. 18-year-old Aaron Blocker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was January 2011, and the Mississippi College freshman was doing his best to pay attention in his chemistry class. Chemistry was usually Aaron's favorite class. He dreamed of being a scientist himself. But today, he was distracted. His stomach was cramping, and he really had to go to the bathroom. Aaron had Crohn's disease, an illness that causes stomach cramps, severe weight loss, and diarrhea. He'd been diagnosed the year before, but for the past few weeks, he'd been suffering from a prolonged flare-up. Already this morning, Aaron had left the lecture hall 3 times to go to the restroom. Aaron tried to ignore all the twisting and churning that was going on in his stomach and just listen to the lecture, but pretty soon, Aaron realized he couldn't ignore it any longer. So, like he already had 3 other times so far this morning, he quietly got up and began heading for the door again. But as Aaron climbed the stairs that led out of the lecture hall, he tripped over a backpack and nearly fell. Now, immediately, Aaron heard people laughing at him in the classroom, but that didn't really bother him, because all Aaron was thinking is, thank goodness that was not worse. Aaron had always been a bit uncoordinated, and he did fall kind of a lot, and unfortunately, he was very prone to breaking bones from even the mildest of impacts. As a child, he had managed to break his nose, his fingers, and his wrist, and he had also dislocated several joints. Thankfully, though, on this day, Aaron did reach the doors of the lecture hall in one piece, and then once Aaron was out the doors, he hustled his way down the hall towards the bathroom. 2 nights later, Aaron sat in the college cafeteria across from his girlfriend, Emily, who he had been dating for nearly a year. Aaron was a grade ahead of Emily, so she was actually still in high school. She was a senior. But his college was not far from her home, and so she came to visit him whenever she could. Emily had just gotten her first tattoo, and she was telling Aaron all about the experience, but Aaron was having a really hard time focusing on her story. The distinctive sort of greasy aroma of sloppy joes and tater tots filled the busy dining hall, and it was making Aaron feel really nauseous. He was on a restrictive diet because of his Crohn's disease, and the cafeteria's very greasy food was brutal on his stomach. But his dorm didn't have a kitchen, so he really had no other choice but to try to eat as much as he could handle. As he tried to force down some food, his stomach suddenly spasmed and Aaron clutched his belly in pain. Emily saw this and stopped her story and asked if he was okay, but Aaron sort of brushed it off. He said he was used to the pain and told her not to worry. But this time, the pain was just too much, and Aaron doubled over in agony as another spasm cut through his gut. Emily shot up from her chair and put her arm around him, and then whispered to him that he really needed to go see a doctor. And Aaron nodded and told her that, his abdominal pains had been getting worse and worse for days. And so Emily gathered up all their things and then called a taxi to take them to the nearest hospital. A couple of hours later, Aaron laid in a hospital bed in the emergency room with Emily sitting by his side. The doctor had ordered an immediate CT scan of Aaron's abdomen, and so now they were just waiting for the results. Aaron clutched Emily's hand and let out a deep breath. He was, unfortunately, quite used to hospitals, doctors, needles, and machines. And in virtue of being Aaron's girlfriend, Emily, too, was very accustomed to this environment. Aaron was very grateful to have his girlfriend by his side. And so he looked up at Emily, and he told her he just could not imagine going through all this stuff by himself. But before she could reply, the ER doctor came into the room with Aaron's test results. And the doctor got straight to the point and said he'd found something very troubling in Aaron's CT scan. But it was actually not Aaron's gut that was concerning the doctor. He said during the CT scan, as they're trying to photograph his abdomen, the scan had kind of inadvertently caught a bit of Aaron's hip bones. And basically, the bones showed signs that they were dying. It's a condition called a vascular necrosis, which happens when blood supply to a bone is cut off, and so the tissue decays. Aaron closed his eyes and grimaced. He wondered if maybe this condition he'd never even heard of might explain his history of so many broken bones. Aaron quickly filled the doctor in about his medical history and how doctors had really struggled to figure out why his bones always seemed so brittle. Throughout his childhood and teenage years, Aaron had been tested for various conditions, from common issues like arthritis to a rare genetic condition called Wilson's disease. But each time, the results were either negative or inconclusive. It wasn't until Aaron was diagnosed with Crohn's disease a year ago that Aaron finally got an answer that sort of made sense. His doctor had told him that because his Crohn's disease had been untreated for so long, Aaron had been malnourished, and as a result, his bones were weakened. But that was a year ago, and since then, Aaron had done everything in his power to eat right and build up his strength, and so it just seemed like, he would have been doing better by now. The ER doctor listened closely and took a bunch of notes. Then, after Aaron was done speaking, the doctor asked him if he was taking any new medications. And Aaron nodded and said that yes, for the past 8 weeks, he'd been taking low doses of a steroid called prednisone to help reduce the inflammation caused by Crohn's disease. Aaron could see from the ER doctor's expression that he was puzzled. The doctor said that steroids could cause bone damage like this, but only with prolonged use and high doses. In his opinion, 8 weeks was just not enough time to cause this much damage to Aaron's hips. But just to be safe, the ER doctor recommended that Aaron go see the other doctor who'd prescribed him this steroid to see if maybe they could change his treatment plan. Aaron's mind was swirling. He had convinced himself that if he could just get his Crohn's disease under control, he could live a normal college student life. But now here he was being told he had an even bigger problem with no clear solution. And so Aaron shook his head in disbelief. But at the same time, he tried to stay positive. He hoped that if he stopped taking steroids, his bones would stop breaking down and he would get better. 2 years later, on a muggy summer day, Aaron clutched the sticky vinyl seat of a campus shuttle bus. Every time the bus hit even the smallest of bumps, Aaron would feel pain shooting through his hips. Aaron was now 20 years old and working hard towards his degree in biology and medical sciences. It was fascinating to him to learn how the human body worked. He hoped that someday he'd know enough to understand what was happening to him. Because Aaron was still in constant pain. His weakened hips made it really hard for him to walk around campus, so he took the shuttle bus as often as he could, even though it was quite painful. Right after visiting the emergency room 2 years earlier, Aaron had stopped taking steroids, but that hadn't helped, and his hips had only gotten worse. At this rate, Aaron knew he could be facing a hip replacement surgery before he even turned 30 years old. When the shuttle bus came to a stop, Aaron carefully climbed down the steps and limped into the lobby of the school's medical building for an appointment with his orthopedist. He sighed as he shuffled his way into the very familiar waiting room. Doctors and nurses and hospitals were now as much a part of Aaron's life as college professors. A few minutes later, Aaron hobbled into an exam room and climbed up onto the crisp white paper covering the examination table. When the doctor arrived, he asked Aaron to lie down, but Aaron was in so much pain, the doctor had to actually help him lie down. After poking and prodding Aaron and also guiding Aaron's legs through several movements to check his range of motion, the doctor stepped back and grabbed Aaron's latest scans and began looking them over. And as he did, Aaron could tell he was very likely about to hear some bad news. He had seen that same concerned look on many doctors' faces in the past. Finally, the orthopedist lowered the paperwork and told Aaron that his vascular necrosis in his hip bones had continued to worsen and it was leaving behind a lot of dead bone tissue. And so he wanted Aaron to consider a surgery called core decompression to remove the diseased bone in Aaron's hips. Once the dead bone was gone, new blood vessels could develop and healthy bone could grow back. Ideally, this procedure would reduce Aaron's pain and help him avoid total hip replacement surgery down the road. Aaron was so desperate to feel better that he only had one question. How soon could they schedule this surgery? 8 weeks later, Aaron was at home in his small off-campus apartment, studying in bed. He hadn't been able to move much since his surgery, and he was irritable at how slow his recovery had been. He was having trouble focusing on the biology textbook he was reading, so he put it down and reached for the TV remote. But when he clicked the power button, the TV wouldn't turn on. Aaron wondered if maybe the remote's batteries were dead, so he carefully swung his legs over the side of the bed, grabbed onto his headboard, and pulled himself upright. Then Aaron grabbed the aluminum walker right next to his bed that he needed just to get around, and he inched his way across the room to his desk. He pulled 2 AA batteries out of the desk, but then he dropped one of the batteries as well as the back of the TV remote onto the floor. And Aaron suddenly thought to himself, what is he going to do? Getting down on the floor on his hands and knees was just totally out of the question. It would not only be very painful, but he also might not be able to stand up again. And so Aaron just suddenly felt overwhelmed by how much pain he was in, how inconvenient his life now was, and also just the fact that 2 months after surgery, it just did not feel like he was getting any better. But just then, Aaron heard the key in the front door, and a moment later, his girlfriend Emily called out his name. Aaron was so relieved that she was there. He yelled that he was in his bedroom and he could really use some help. Emily came into the room and she could see that Aaron was very distraught. She helped him back into his bed and then reached under the dresser to retrieve the battery and the back of the remote. Emily suggested that Aaron just close his eyes for a half hour and she'd make him some lunch. Aaron smiled and felt so thankful to have Emily in his life, and then he did close his eyes. But Aaron was too anxious about his situation to fall asleep. It felt like his life's goals were slipping away from him. Aaron had had to take time off of school after the surgery, and he didn't want to delay getting his degree any longer. And so he really just had to find a way to get better soon, or else the future that he longed for with Emily just wouldn't be able to exist. One month later, a nurse at the orthopedist's office led Aaron into an exam room and closed the door behind them. Aaron attempted to climb the tiny step stool in front of the examination table like he had done so many times in the past, but this time the pain in his hips was so extreme he just couldn't do it, so he opted for a chair instead. A minute later, Aaron heard a soft knock on the door and his orthopedist came in. The doctor pulled up a stool in front of the room's computer monitor so they could look at the results of Aaron's latest CT scans. Once the doctor had pulled up the images, he pointed to the balls in both of Aaron's hip sockets, and then he pulled up another image of a healthy hip joint to compare. The doctor said that on the healthy hip, the ball and socket looked like a smooth, round sphere surrounded by space. But on Aaron's hips, the balls looked broken down and fractured. The joints were surrounded by white shadows that represented scar tissue that had grown and grown over the years. This was obviously not what the doctor or Aaron had hoped for. The bones in his hips were grinding together and continuing to break down, which meant the core decompression surgery was a failure. Aaron asked the doctor why his bones kept decaying no matter what doctors recommended, and the doctor admitted he simply didn't know. The doctor said the next step would be a double hip replacement surgery. But he assured Aaron that although it was unusual to replace hips in someone so young as Aaron, it was a common surgery with great results. And so he told Aaron that after his surgery, he would very likely be able to walk easily again and his pain would be gone. But despite that, this was still a very difficult decision for Aaron. If he went through with the hip replacement surgery, he would need up to a year of recovery and rehab, which would mean putting his schoolwork on hold again when he was so looking forward to graduation and doing scientific or biomedical research in the real world. And so this was going to be a really challenging decision. But then Aaron stood up to go get his jacket, and his hips hurt so much just walking the 3 feet to the coat hanger, Aaron realized he really had no choice here. The pain was so bad and it was only getting worse, and so he basically had to do the hip replacement surgery. 4 years later, in 2016, the clock radio on Aaron's nightstand belted out a pop song, jolting him awake. Aaron rolled over and hit the snooze button, and as he did, he smiled. Before his hip replacement 4 years ago, rolling over would have been so painful, but now he was moving just fine. It had taken a long time to become this healthy again. Following the hip replacement surgery, Aaron had to stop going in person to school and take online classes in order to finish his degree on time. He spent his time mostly indoors and bedridden, but slowly he had regained his mobility and had gotten his life back on track. Aaron had graduated from college and was now pursuing a master's degree in biomedical research at Mississippi College. At the age of 24, 4 years after the surgeries, Aaron was finally focusing on his future rather than his pain. Through it all, Emily had stayed by his side, like always. And at the end of 2012, Aaron asked her to marry him, and to his delight, she had said yes. They were married on August 1st, 2013, the best day of Aaron's life. Aaron could hear Emily in the kitchen cooking up some breakfast. A moment later, she called to him and asked if he wanted some eggs. Aaron yelled back that he'd be right there as he put his slippers on. Just then, Aaron's alarm clock went off again, and without thinking, Aaron twisted around to stop it. And as he did, he suddenly felt an excruciating pain in his left hip. The worst pain he had ever felt in his entire life. Aaron instantly writhed in pain and fell back on the bed and shouted for Emily. She rushed into the bedroom and tried to help Aaron stand, but he couldn't move his left leg at all because the pain was now totally unbearable. And so through gritted teeth, he asked Emily to hand him his phone, and when she did, Aaron called a friend, and a few minutes later, that friend arrived, and together with Emily, they helped lift Aaron up and carried him out to the car so they could drive him to the hospital. An hour later, Aaron lay on a gurney staring up at the hospital ceiling lights flashing past him as the ER staff whisked him down a hospital corridor to the CT scan room. Aaron had hoped that these emergency visits were behind him, but here he was again amidst the smell of disinfectant, the high-pitched sounds of equipment, and very sick people just like him. In the scan room, technicians helped move Aaron's aching body to the motorized table, making Aaron groan every time they touched him. As the table began to move, Aaron could hear buzzing and whirring noises as the machinery took images of his hips and midsection. Even lying there was painful, because Aaron had to clench his muscles to keep his legs perfectly still. Once the scan was over, Aaron clenched his teeth in pain as the technicians shifted him back onto the gurney and then wheeled him back to a waiting room. And after an agonizing hour of waiting, a doctor finally came in the room to go over the results. As the ER doctor pulled up Aaron's files on the room's computer, Aaron filled him in on his history with Crohn's disease, a vascular necrosis, and hip replacements. Aaron was so accustomed to recounting his medical history that it now came out like a well-rehearsed presentation. The doctor turned the computer monitor towards Aaron and told him that based on the scan, his hip implant had popped out of the socket and shifted into the wrong place. So the dislocated hip would have to be adjusted manually, a procedure the doctor warned would hurt, but only for a moment. The doctor asked Aaron if he was ready for the adjustment, and Aaron just sort of nodded and said okay. Then a second doctor came in to help with the procedure. Together, these doctors all around the bed forcefully pushed Aaron's hip back into place. And true to their word, it was a split second of agonizing pain. But it quickly dissipated, and Aaron felt much better. He asked the doctor what was next, and he got a familiar answer. Go back to your orthopedic surgeon for a follow-up. Several days later, Aaron sat inside the usual exam room at his orthopedist's office. The doctor examined Aaron's CT scans in silence for a minute, and then finally he spoke, and Aaron felt his heart sink. The doctor said that even though they had successfully popped the hip back into place, that didn't solve the underlying problem. Aaron's left hip implant had become loose because the bone around it was still decaying, and it was now only a matter of time until the same thing happened with his other leg. As a result, his hip implants were now too small to properly fit inside of their sockets. Aaron was shocked. How could this have happened? He'd followed all his doctor's instructions for years throughout his multiple recoveries and rehabs. He was very careful with his hips and he stayed away from really strenuous activities. And yet, he'd still dislocated his hip just from getting out of bed. It felt like all the progress he'd made was kind of for nothing. Aaron wondered what he could even do at this point to ease his pain. The orthopedic surgeon told Aaron that he couldn't really explain why Aaron's hips were in such bad shape, but he could tell him what should be done to respond. The only remedy he could suggest for now was to remove the damaged old implants and replace them again with larger ones. Aaron left the doctor's office in silence and headed for the parking lot. Then, alone, inside of his car, Aaron burst into tears. He just didn't know how much longer he could keep going like this. By the time Aaron got home, his despair had morphed into anger. He had already endured 11 serious surgeries and more broken bones than he could count, and he was only 24 years old. He'd seen a parade of doctors, and none of them had come remotely close to figuring out what was actually wrong with him. Even if he got another hip replacement, Aaron knew it was only a matter of time until he would have to do it again and again and again if his bones continued to decay. Aaron wondered if maybe he would just spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Just then, Emily got home from work, and when Aaron saw her, he went from being mad back to being sad all over again, and he broke down and just started crying. Emily tried to comfort him, but Aaron was inconsolable. So Emily just kind of let Aaron vent, and then once he was done crying and kind of talking about what was going on, she asked him to come keep her company in the kitchen while she made them dinner. Aaron smiled at her and then slowly eased himself into a chair at the kitchen table while Emily poured them each some wine. A few minutes later, Aaron had calmed down and he was thinking clearly, and he told Emily that too many elements of his medical story just didn't add up. Why would his hip implants fail after 4 years when they were supposed to last 20 years? Why didn't any of the other surgeries work? What was actually going on with his bones? If he was going to subject himself to yet another hip surgery, Aaron wanted to make sure he'd exhausted all other options first. But at this point, Aaron didn't trust any doctor to figure it out for him. So if he was going to find a solution, he felt like he would need to do it himself. Several weeks later, Aaron sat in bed with his laptop resting on his lap. Next to him, Emily was quietly reading a book. Aaron had compiled just about all of his medical records dating back to when he was a child, and finally, thanks to his years of studies, he could actually understand what they all meant. When he looked at all of his records together, Aaron found patterns that did make sense for a person suffering from Crohn's disease. But so far, nothing he was seeing could explain his weakened bones. Then, all of a sudden, Aaron sat up straight with a huge smile on his face. Emily noticed and put her book down and asked what was going on. and he showed her a series of his medical records going back a decade, all indicating severely low levels of an enzyme he'd only heard of once before, called alkaline phosphatase. Back in 2010, when Aaron was a junior in high school, one of his doctors had noticed he had low levels of this enzyme, which was why Aaron had been tested for the genetic condition called Wilson's disease. Now, Aaron did not think much of this at the time, since the results were inconclusive, and no one had ever mentioned the enzyme again. But as Aaron dove deeper into his medical records, he noticed the low levels of the enzyme in 2011 as well, and 2012, and 2013. In fact, every year since 2010, his blood tests indicated low levels of alkaline phosphatase. Emily and Aaron looked at each other. What was this enzyme, and what did having low levels of it mean? They wondered if maybe it was the key to understanding what was going wrong with Aaron's body. Emily looked on hopefully as Aaron typed in, "What is alkaline phosphatase?" into an online search engine. The first result he got back was for a website dedicated to an ultra-rare disease with a long name Aaron had never heard of. Aaron clicked on it, and then immediately after reading just a couple of sentences, he looked at Emily with a big smile on his face. All of his symptoms matched up with what he was reading. Aaron had no doubt he had just found what he was looking for. A week later, Aaron sat across from his doctor, studying his face as the physician read over the printed out pages Aaron had brought for him. The doctor was unfamiliar with this very rare disease that Aaron had found online, but he agreed that it did make a lot of sense, and it could be directly caused by the low levels of alkaline phosphatase in his blood. Aaron suspected he had a condition called hypophosphatasia. It's an ultra-rare metabolic bone disease that affects the body's ability to make alkaline phosphatase, which helps bones stay healthy by absorbing essential minerals like calcium, phosphate, and magnesium. When there's a deficiency in alkaline phosphatase, the minerals don't get absorbed by the bone. Instead, these minerals collect on tendons, kidneys, and other organs and cause serious damage. In Aaron's case, they had collected on his hip bones. Aaron's doctor ordered immediate bone scans to test for hypophosphatasia, and a few days later, the bone scans confirmed Aaron's theory was right. Miraculously, Aaron solved his own lifelong health crisis. In 2018, 1 year after his successful diagnosis, Aaron started on enzyme replacement therapy, which is the only treatment known for hypophosphatasia. Aaron also had 9 more surgeries to undo damage that had already been done to his body. But since starting the enzyme replacement treatments, Aaron's bones have stopped decaying, and calcium deposits in other parts of his body have disappeared completely. As for his Crohn's disease, which actually had nothing to do with his bone condition, that is in remission. But to this day, Aaron still does deal with small levels of pain every single day. Aaron successfully finished his master's degree and started a family with his wife. Currently, he works as a data and analytics consultant for a hospital system and is a prominent patient advocate for hypophosphatasia. On the morning of August 30th, 2001, a middle-aged police sergeant named Alan McGregor drove with his partner, Officer Mark David, towards the Huron National Forest, which is a massive nature preserve in northern Michigan. The two of them were on the way to this forest to meet with a very unlikely detective, who McGregor believed might actually be the key to solving a case that had haunted him for the last 21 years. And that case was the disappearance of Cherita Thomas. Back in 1980, Cherita Thomas had been walking down the road, located about 1 mile away from the police station where Sergeant McGregor worked, when she had gotten into the car with this older man who had come by to pick her up. And after getting in this car, she was never seen again. Based on various tips and clues, police were nearly certain that that older man who had picked Cherita up was a guy named Jimmy Nelson. And their theory was he had murdered Cherita shortly after picking her up, and then afterwards disposed of her body in a particular section of the Huron National Forest. But the problem was, the police did not have any actual evidence that supported this theory. Their case against Jimmy was entirely circumstantial. In fact, they didn't even know if Cherita had really been murdered, because for the last 20 plus years, they had searched that particular section of the Huron National Forest, they'd gotten the FBI involved, they had chased down every lead, yet still, they had not found Cherita's body. so they really didn't know what happened. But as Sergeant McGregor neared the forest, he hoped that today would be the day that all changed. He pulled up by the entrance of the Huron National Forest, and he and his partner got their first look at their unlikely detective they were here to meet. And this detective was a Doberman Pinscher mix with big floppy ears who was lying on the ground and panting and wagging his tail. His name was Eagle, and he didn't look like a stereotypical police dog because he wasn't a police dog. However, Eagle was the best crime scene sniffing dog in the entire world. His trainer, a 40-year-old woman named Sandra Anderson, was standing right beside him. Now, Sandra and Eagle were very famous in law enforcement circles, and so Sergeant McGregor and his partner were already well aware of their backstory. Sandra had actually adopted Eagle from a pound shortly before he likely would have been euthanized. And then after she adopted him, Sandra, who had made a career in teaching dogs how to sniff for cadavers, just sort of naturally on her off time, began training Eagle how to do it too. And amazingly, Eagle really took to it, better than police dogs did. Now, any good police cadaver dog could sniff out hidden objects and track a scent for miles, and Eagle could definitely do that. But also, Eagle could do things that the police cadaver dogs simply could not. Like he could smell blood that had been cleaned with bleach and also painted over. I mean, that's like a superpower. No dog could do that, but Eagle could. One forensic anthropologist who had come in contact with Eagle and seen what he could do firsthand said that, if a great cadaver dog was rated a 10 out of 10, well, Eagle was like a 20 out of 10. He was far and away the best of the best. And so Sergeant McGregor believed that if Cherita's body really was in that section of the Huron National Forest, well, Eagle would be able to find it. Sergeant McGregor was excited to see Eagle in action. But after he and his partner parked, they walked over and spent a minute, petting Eagle because Sandra said it was fine, and they gave him some pets, and Eagle really liked it, and he sort of rubbed up against them. But then at some point, Eagle just kind of stopped and looked towards the entrance of the National Forest, like he was ready to go. At which point Sandra said, okay, he's ready to work. So Sergeant McGregor and his partner followed behind Sandra and Eagle as they led the way into the forest towards the section where they had been told to search. And then once they reached that section, McGregor and his partner kind of stayed back on the fringes and just watched Eagle work. And it was incredible. Now, McGregor and his partner had seen police dogs work before, so they were familiar with basically the pace at which these dogs would find something, which often, it would take some time. But basically, as soon as they got to this clearing, they're watching Eagle and he's sort of walking around, sniffing, looking for something. But then suddenly he stopped, turned, and made a beeline towards this tree. And when he got there, he began pawing at the ground like he had found something. Sandra, his trainer, kneeled down next to him to see what Eagle had found, and she saw as he continued to dig that there was something in the ground. And so she called out to McGregor and his partner, and they came rushing over, and sure enough, Eagle had found a human bone fragment. To be clear, this dog only finds human bones, and so it's not like it would be able to find a chicken bone and think it was a human bone. Basically, if it found a bone, it's a human bone. McGregor and his partner were totally shocked here. I mean, they had really high hopes for the search, but to already be finding human remains in this particular section of the forest was revelatory. I mean, not only was it a big deal to find human remains here, but these could be Cherita's. This could be the key to unlocking this 2 decades old case. But Sandra, Eagle's trainer, did not seem shocked at all. This was pretty much par for the course. She smiled at the 2 investigators and kind of shrugged like, yep, this is what he does. She gave him a treat. And then Eagle got up and just continued searching the area. After Sandra and Eagle had taken off, McGregor and his partner bagged the bone fragment and then just kind of continued to let Eagle do his work. And over the course of that day, Eagle just kept on finding more human bones. It was truly incredible. And then the next day, when they came back for a second search, Eagle found even more. It was like there were human bones all over the place. However, this was actually kind of typical for human remains that have been left out in the wild for a long time, like they believed Cherita's had been. The idea is, after the body is left there and decomposes, animals come along and break apart the bones and kind of carry them in different directions. There's weather, there's a bunch of things that affect the body that sort of gradually takes it and spreads it all over the place. But as alarming as it was to find this many human bone fragments in such a small area in this forest, at the end of that second search on the second day, McGregor, all he could feel was elation.
He felt like Eagle had done the exact thing he was hoping he would do. He had found the remains that very likely were Cherita Thomas's. McGregor thanked Sandra and Eagle profusely for their help, and then after saying bye to them, he and his partner went back to the station and they sent off the bone fragments to the FBI to be analyzed. And then after sending them off, they waited. The analysis would take several months, but in February of 2002, the FBI finally called McGregor. Now at this point, McGregor was very hopeful and sort of expected that these bone fragments would belong to Cherita, but what they actually said shocked him, because according to the FBI, those bone fragments that Eagle had dug up did not belong to Cherita. In fact, the bone fragments didn't even belong to a single person. They belonged to 3 different people. And when McGregor heard this, his blood ran cold, because he wasn't thinking, oh boy, this totally blows up the case. Instead, he's thinking, I bet Cherita is out in that forest. We just haven't found her yet, and if we keep using Eagle, we will find her. But now I have at least 3 more people that have been found out there, 3 dead people. So maybe Jimmy is way worse than I thought he was. Maybe he didn't just kill Cherita, maybe he's a serial killer and he's dumping his bodies in that part of the forest. However, as explosive as this new information was, it only made things way more complicated for McGregor, because he and his partner and all of his colleagues had no idea who these 3 new bodies were. And neither did the FBI. The FBI could only determine that these bone fragments came from 3 different people, but who they were, they didn't know. And so, to try to figure out who these 3 people were, Sergeant McGregor would need to find more clues. And to find more clues, he needed Eagle to go back to the forest and keep on looking. And so he immediately reached out to Sandra, who said that she and Eagle would come back out there and search the forest again. The new search began on April 17th, 2002. McGregor, his partner, Sandra, Eagle, and a whole bunch of police officers and crime lab technicians descended once again on that same section of the Huron National Forest. But after a kind of lengthy search that day, the police officers, the entire police force that showed up, they didn't find anything of note. But Eagle, he did. At some point, Eagle had sniffed out a human knuckle bone in a dried out stream bed. When this discovery was made, Officer McGregor was elated, because it was like, once again, we are finding evidence that's going to help him break this case he has been trying to crack for 20 years, which now might actually be way bigger than he thought it was. It might not just be the murder of Cherita. This might be the hunting grounds or the dumping grounds of a serial killer who killed Cherita Thomas. And he, McGregor, was going to be the one who solved it. He just knew it. But when McGregor turned back around to continue searching in the area that he was looking, he suddenly heard this commotion coming from behind him, sort of in the same direction where that human knuckle bone had been found. And he turns around and he sees what looks to be some sort of physical altercation happening amongst 2 people. He can't really tell who it is, but there's screaming happening. It's total chaos. And so, having no idea what was going on, McGregor abandoned his search, turned, and ran to go break it up. And after this fight was broken up, another major discovery was made. But it was not another bone. It would turn out the person who was dumping bodies in this section of the Huron National Forest was not a serial killer, nor was it Jimmy Nelson. Instead, the real culprit was actually one of the investigators who was out here doing this search right now. Eagle was not the world's greatest cadaver-sniffing dog. In fact, Eagle was not even a cadaver-sniffing dog at all. And his trainer, Sandra, was well aware of that, because this was all a big act. It would turn out, when Sandra and her dog were called out to a site to perform a search, Sandra would show up with a stash of human bones tucked into her clothing, right up against her skin. And then once the search began, she would discreetly pull little bone fragments out and drop them on the ground in front of Eagle, who would immediately notice them and alert people to them, making it seem like Sandra and her dog had once again saved the day. Sandra did this dozens of times across dozens of searches all over the country, all because she loved the thrill of watching the police discover her crimes in real time. Sandra had been successfully searching for body parts that she herself had planted for years without anybody being remotely suspicious of her. However, during the search for Cherita Thomas, Sandra got caught. Right before that fight broke out on that last search, Sandra and her dog had stepped off to the side and believed nobody was watching them, and Sandra bent down and pulled a bone fragment out of her sock and was about to place it, but then realized a crime lab technician was clearly watching her. She had been caught. And so the crime lab technician went up to Sandra to call her out on it, and Sandra, who knew she was caught, began to panic and pretended that she was being attacked by the crime lab technician and made a whole scene about it. That's what McGregor heard when he turned around and wondered if there was a fight going on. There was no fight. It was just Sandra, again, being caught red-handed. But as awful as Sandra's actions sound, she didn't actually kill anyone. Instead, during her years-long run of fraudulent searching, she had been stealing pieces of medical center cadavers and using those. Sandra ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple felonies, including falsifying evidence and obstruction of justice, and so she was sentenced to 21 months in prison. After she was caught, the FBI had to go back and reevaluate 50 murder cases that Sandra and Eagle had been involved in. Luckily though, during this examination, they discovered that in all of these cases, they did not hinge on evidence that Sandra had found. And so there were no convictions that were overturned. As for Jimmy Nelson, he was eventually convicted of Cherita's murder. However, his conviction was overturned. But it had nothing to do with Sandra and Eagle. The evidence used to overturn it was completely separate. And so to this day, we still don't know what happened to Cherita, and her body has still not been found. As for Eagle, nobody was mad at him, and he retired from working crime scenes and got as many treats as he wanted until he passed away peacefully in 2003. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here.